From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. The opioids on Toronto streets are getting more toxic, including some with additives that make it harder to help people who overdose. New research has found that a number of ultra-potent synthetic opioids to be circulating in Toronto's drug market, including some that are many times stronger than fentanyl. As well, the other measurement to note is that opioid-related deaths in Toronto jumped 80% from 2019 to 2020, claiming 521 lives. It is a situation that is only primed to get worse. Robert Cribb is an investigative reporter at The Star and the director of the Investigative Journalism Bureau at the University of Toronto. He joins to discuss the opioid crisis in Toronto now and the far-reaching ramifications it has. Rob, thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, thanks, Reggie. Appreciate it.
So, Rob, your latest is an incredible look at how synthetic opioids are exacerbating the situation, but I just want to start a little bit bigger about this. The opioid crisis has just surged during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, it's been unbelievable, unprecedented numbers. Nobody's ever seen these kinds of numbers before.
I think that one of the keys is that from 2019 to 2020, there was an 80% increase in deaths, and that number in Toronto was 521 people. I just want people to know how serious this is, right? Now, the thing is, your latest is about synthetic opioids. Can you tell us a little bit about them and what you found and how this is likely only going to make the situation worse?
So it's fascinating in that we actually don't know very much about these things at all. They've emerged recently, and when people started looking to figure out where they came from, it turns out they date back to the 1950s. They were synthesized as prospective pain relievers, but never proved, sort of disappeared off the radar screen of everyone that we've talked to, and have only now reemerged through this testing of street drugs that happens in some cities in Canada, including Toronto. And, even the World Health Organization doesn't seem to know very much about this. There's physicians and researchers that we've talked to don't know very much about them. So it is really a totally fascinating and terrifying reemergence of these drugs from the 1950s that because of the disruptions in the supply chain in street drugs in this country as a result of the pandemic, they've somehow reemerged and are appearing in ever greater numbers through these street drug checks that we got the data to analyze. So the truth is, there's not a lot I can tell you about it. There's not a lot anybody can really tell you about these specific drugs because they really are totally mysterious.
Let's talk about where you got this data. What are these street drug checks? These are toxicology reports. Who's doing them? And what are some of the numbers that they've recently found?
So these tests are done by a research agency called the Center on Drug Policy Evaluation. It's a Toronto-based agency that's made up of academics at the U of T as well as researchers. And it's a fascinating process I knew little about. So they actually collect donations, tiny amounts of drugs from users and dealers actually in Toronto who want to check the contents of their supply. And they have Special Health Canada approval. A bike courier basically shows up every day at 5 different locations across the city. They pick them up, they courier them to one of 2 labs, one at CAMH and one at St. Mike's, which does the testing and then ultimately determines through their very complex, sophisticated gear what's inside those drugs. And so it's a service, it's a public service intended to both conduct research and also obviously protect the lives of those who wish to provide their samples. So we were able to get access through our work to that raw data and get really careful, customized analysis of what the results have been pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, right up until a couple months ago. And so what it showed is huge increases in toxicity and contamination of these drugs, most notably what are called these ultra-potent or high-potency opioids, which are the things that we ultimately focused in our story because they're totally novel and unprecedented. So where drug users may think that they're purchasing and consuming fentanyl, what the drug tests show is that that's not the case at all. Unexpectedly and unwittingly, they're consuming a cocktail of various opioids that they know nothing about, including benzos and other opioids that are synthesized at much, much higher levels than fentanyl. So you can sort of see the obvious horrifying risk of this. You think you're consuming one thing and you're consuming something completely different. And the way that all of these various cocktail of drugs interact makes it all more risky and ultimately makes it much more difficult to return from overdose. Even if there's someone there to witness it and to administer naloxone, it can sometimes not work because of the mysterious complexity of this cocktail.
I want to talk about some of the synthetic opioids specifically. I'm probably going to stumble over some of these names, but I just want to talk about how much stronger than fentanyl is. This is one of these things, obviously, never tried it, but we know that has been such a scourge, and yet some of these drugs are 10 to 20 times as strong we're seeing on these streets. So one of the first ones you mentioned in your story is etonitazepine. Now, this is 10 to 20 times as strong as fentanyl, and it was just showing up in drug tests 2 weeks ago in the city. Is that correct?
Yeah, this one is brand new. It just appeared in the last round of testing that was conducted by the CDPE, and they immediately flagged it to us, and they're issuing a public statement about it today, I think. So again, totally mysterious, never seen before in the drug supply in the city. And frankly, nobody really seemed to know what it was. And still, we're sort of struggling to figure out what it is and where it came from. We've asked that question to so many people, and it really is a lot of blank faces. What we know is that the supply chain, the path, the traditional pre-pandemic supply chain of drugs that make it into this country and ultimately show up on the streets was disrupted. Like supply chains in any industry, it has been disrupted. But that's sort of what we know. The details behind that and which drugs, how, when, is still a real mystery. And there's still a lot of work to be done on that to understand the nitty-gritty of how specifically the supply chain has been disrupted. But what we can see from this data that we published today is the ultimate sort of conclusion of it, right? This is the end of the supply chain. And this is when the drugs are on the street and being consumed. And what we can definitively say from this data is the level of contamination is breathtaking and previously unseen.
Another thing you mentioned in the story is carfentanil, which is 100 times more potent than fentanyl. It's back in the street supply. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so carfentanil, that may be familiar to some of your listeners in the sense that it did have a history in Ontario. Sort of around 2016 to 2019, it emerged. And then last year, the Health Canada data that we looked at showed that it disappeared. What this data set shows, now again, this is a different data set. So this is Toronto street drug checking, which is really reliable, interesting data because it really is where the rubber hits the road. It is taking drugs off the street and testing it. And so this is very much the reality, the experience for those who are consuming street drugs. And they started testing in 2019, and carfentanil has now shown up in increasing amounts throughout the testing. And carfentanil is terrifying, right? As you say, 100 times more potent than fentanyl, sort of unimaginable death tolls with carfentanil. And you can just imagine people not knowing that this is in their supply because they think they're buying one thing, and of course they have no idea. And then consuming something with carfentanil in it, it's just utterly devastating. The odds of overdose and even death skyrocket when there's carfentanil. And so, it really is, as one of the researchers that we talked to said, this is this terrifying kind of human experiment where so many people are consuming drugs with contents that they have no concept of, and the risks would be unimaginable, And so, and then ultimately, of course, you see it in the ultimate statistics here, which is deaths, and as you say, an 81% increase from 2019 to 2020 in Toronto. And it's pretty easy to draw a straight line between that number and the results that we're seeing in these drug tests.
We'll be right back. So the other one that you mentioned was benzos, benzodiazepines, which are basically sedatives and fairly popular, but they're also being cut with a lot of drugs as well, correct?
Yeah, so benzos, lots of people will know benzos. These are among the most popular drugs in Canada prescribed. They're perfectly legal, legitimate drugs, sedatives, anxiety issues, but they're showing up again in ever increasing numbers in the cocktail of drugs that are being tested. And as a compounding effect, mixed with all of these other drugs, they produce a greater level of toxicity, first of all. But secondly, from everything that we've looked at, they complicate the process of returning someone in overdose out of overdose. So we talked to this remarkable woman who basically allows people into her home. She's a drug user historically, and now tries to help drug users by making sure that at least they are being viewed and they have oversight when they're using. So she welcomes them into her house, and we tell the story of a man who went into overdose under her watch in the fall. And despite the fact having naloxone and the treatment at the ready to help him, she nearly lost him. And ultimately, according to her, it was the benzos that were cut into the drugs that are really complicating the ability to save people's lives in moments of crisis.
Okay, so we add all this up, and there's obviously an ever-increasing, more toxic drug supply. Obviously, drugs don't care for borders. This is not contained to Toronto. How is this sort of having ramifications across Ontario, across the country?
Yeah, so the numbers across Ontario are way up. We also looked at another data set, which is essentially coroner's data, Ontario coroner's data, increasing 41% deaths from overdose 2019 to 2020. Northern cities showing up as some of the worst rates. So cities like Timmins, North Bay, Sudbury, Thunder Bay. When you look at the deaths per 100,000, it's those cities that are showing up near the top. Dramatic jumps from 2018 in the order of 150 to 175% among the top cities. We talked to people who work in addiction counseling and emergency addiction services in some of those cities. And, they just tell these heartbreaking stories about the human toll that's unfolding. And it really just struck me. I follow the news pretty closely, and I've certainly read lots of stories on the opioid crisis. But boy, when you really dig inside and you start talking to people who are on the front lines of this thing, it's just utterly horrifying. I mean, it really does feel like a Stephen King novel.
Rob, you mentioned it a bit, but how has the pandemic exacerbated this situation? It obviously made it harder to access safe injection sites for users, but did it also lead to the, I guess we'll call it creativity in bringing back some of these more obscure and dangerous drugs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a consensus that it has made things worse. Karen McDonald, who heads up the street drug checking service in Toronto, tells us that, it was heading in this direction pre-pandemic. The toxicity and the contamination of street drugs was trending in this direction. But I think everyone would agree that the pandemic hastened it, spurred the disruption in the supply chain, which led to a quickening of pace and perhaps a more dramatic creativity, as you say, on the part of those who are manufacturing and concocting what we're seeing on the street today. So there's definitely that. So there's the disruption in the supply chain, which speaks to the contents and the toxicity of the drugs. The second sort of hit, I suppose, it's a double hit in the sense that the pandemic did something else completely unrelated to that, but ultimately, compounding the issue of toxicity dramatically, which is, what did it do? It forced us all into isolation, right? So it created all of these restrictions around social distancing and isolation. So now what do you have is drug users, many of whom are now using alone in their apartments instead of being in groups in wherever they live or in public spaces. And the single worst thing you can do in terms of risk as a drug user is to use alone, right? So now you have all of these people who are using more toxic, more dangerous, more deadly opioids alone in their apartments because of social distancing and pandemic restrictions. They don't have access to the kinds of social spaces and safe administration sites that they once did. And so the combination really of those two factors, both triggered by the pandemic, has been, according to sort of all the researchers that we've talked to, has been the cause for such dramatic spikes in the deaths. And so it's a cruel sort of double hit.
So Rob, this is the big question. What are the solutions here?
Well, as you know, right, this has been debated for a very, very long time, and it really depends on who you talk to. So if you talk to those who are on the street level, so those advocates and those are on the front lines, there's no question that they feel strongly that safe injection sites are life-saving oases for people who are going to use drugs. There's no question that the sense of oversight and community and care that those locations offer are saving lives. And as evidence, they would point, frankly, to the pandemic and the fact that when those services were disrupted for pandemic reasons, we see the impact, the human toll of that. And so sort of the number one thing that we kept hearing, and we spoke with folks across the country. So in Montreal, we looked at Montreal data, and Vancouver. There was certainly a consensus that the upheaval in access to safe injection sites in combination with these increasingly toxic drugs were the key reason that we're seeing this toll. So it raises really interesting questions. These are politically charged questions. There's no question about it. There is division, it's safe to say, in our society about the role of these safe injection sites. They're politically fraught, I think, for many politicians. But certainly that is the view from users and from those who work with users, that without access to those kinds of safe services, the trending that we're seeing now will only increase.
In closing, can you tell us a little bit about the reaction of the researchers who are seeing these results?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, that was one of the sobering moments in our research. We looked at the data and we analyzed it, and we certainly saw eye-widening numbers. But it's ultimately when you kind of take the numbers and go to the people who study this and are behind the numbers and who generate the numbers to kind of get their reaction, because this is what they do, right? For us, we're looking at stunning increases and spikes that we've never seen with our eyeballs before, right? And so it's always fascinating to take it to people who are seasoned in this work and who do this every day and have done it for many years. And I think the light bulb really went on for me when we were interviewing a couple of the researchers who actually do this testing. So in the labs at CAMH and St. Mike's, and to hear them say things like, they've never seen anything like this before. It is terrifying to see these kinds of numbers. One of them said when he first saw carfentanil show up in drug testing, he called it a holy shit moment, because knowing the impact on the human body from consumption of carfentanil, in the data, in the clinical numbers, he was seeing death. Those numbers represent death. And another one of the researchers talked about this as being this kind of awful social experiment and feeling, and this notion of helplessness. She said, you just see it happening and you can't stop it. And these are really sort of dramatic comments for researchers who typically speak in very clinical language, as you and I know. They've been moved by it and frightened by it in ways that, you don't often hear in an interview with a research scientist who is conveying meaning from numbers. So I remember those interviews and thinking like, wow, this isn't just us looking at numbers from a naive point of view and trying to draw out, meaning that isn't there. Like, it's there. And if it's frightening these people, then we should all be frightened by it.
We should all be concerned, Rob. Thank you so much for making the time today.
Thanks for talking about it.
Robert Cribb is an investigative reporter at The Star and the director of the Investigative Journalism Bureau at the University of Toronto. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.